Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Lori Person Baynard, founder of the African American Public Policy and Advocacy Forum. Today, we have two guests for our speech, and it's Jill Morrison, Esquire, visiting professor of Georgetown School of Law, and Nicole Millix Jobson, MA in Brain-Based Teaching and Learning, and is a counselor at the International College of Counselors. Welcome to our town hall, and thank you for being here. First of all, I would like to ask Jill, how did we get here? In terms of what's happened yesterday with the Supreme Court ruling of affirmative action, how did we get to where we are? Please explain.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So, a brief history of the court's affirmative action cases, combined with the current composition of the court, makes it clear that this should not have been a surprise. Simply put, the court held that the affirmative action, can you hear me better now? That the affirmative action programs of UNC and Harvard, which are pretty typical for most elite institutions, violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So this is a part of the Constitution that says that people cannot be treated worse than others based on their race, religion, or national origin. This amendment was added to the Constitution in 1868, and it was explicitly to address the discrimination that formerly enslaved people were suffering. The court has now interpreted this amendment to require color blindness and has ignored its intent to remedy specific discrimination faced by Black people in America. So fast forward, we have Reconstruction, we have Jim Crow, and finally we have Brown v. Board and the Civil Rights era. So this is when institutions, at the specific demand of many of our parents, decided that they had to remedy some of the historic discrimination that we have always experienced at every level of the society. So Presidents Kennedy and Johnson started making an effort through executive orders to address this, and they started with the area of employment. But of course, we know that education is essential to make one competitive for employment. So we have affirmative action in education. So the first challenge to affirmative action programs came in 1978 in a case called Bakke. So this case involved what some people think of when they think of affirmative action, and that is quotas. So this idea that there are a specific number of seats that are set aside for specific classes of people. So Bakke was a challenge to such a quota, and the court said that that type of affirmative action practice was indeed unconstitutional. But the court said that racial diversity in admissions is a compelling state interest and that colleges are free to consider race when advancing diversity. So step forward to 2003 in Grutter v. Bollinger, the court held that University of Michigan's policy was also fine because the University of Michigan conducted an individualized review of each application to ensure diversity among the student body, including racial diversity. So it did not violate equal protection. The court also envisioned at that time this endpoint. They said 25 years when racial considerations in admissions would no longer be necessary. In 2016, we had the case of Fisher v. Texas, where the court gave more scrutiny to how universities were achieving their objectives to get in a diverse class. So that court required that schools show that their affirmative action programs were narrowly tailored. So this is once again a very specific constitutional requirement that the schools' programs be narrowly tailored to advance diversity. But the court still viewed that as a legitimate state objective. So in this case, the case yesterday, the majority criticized affirmative action as practiced by these two schools, claiming that these schools used race as a proxy for personal characteristics in a way that disadvantaged people from other groups, especially Asian applicants. The court was also disturbed by the what they called kind of unclear goals of affirmative action in training leaders and in having diverse classroom perspectives. And they also noted that there was no logical endpoint, at least to the two affirmative action programs that they were reviewing in their case. So, bottom line, admissions officers are still permitted to consider race. It just has to be in a very individualized manner. Schools cannot use race as a proxy and presume that an applicant has been shaped in some particular way that is meaningful to the school. And they cannot consider the racial makeup of the admitted students as a group and then admit on the basis of race. Another important note is that military academies are excluded from this because many years ago they made a very compelling case that they needed such programs in order to diversify their pool of officers. I can stop there and give you my predictions as we move into the conversation.
One of my questions, a lot of times when people hear about affirmative action and they hear about African Americans getting into these top schools, it's almost like it gives the sense that perhaps the person got in without merit. Nicole, could you explain to us kind of what you do and how merit plays into this?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for hosting this forum. As Jill mentioned, I think it's very important that we understand what the ruling means in terms of college applicants, particularly for high school students and students who are approaching this process. That a university is not prohibited from considering the applicant's race, the impact of their race on their life. And again, as Jill said, just so long as it is tied to a unique ability, capacity, understanding, motivation, and that they can contribute to a college community. So I think it's really important that we understand that part. And so when we are looking at the evaluation of a candidate for acceptance into a college or university, be mindful that none of the students who have been admitted to these highly selective institutions, namely Harvard and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, were ever admitted without being deserving and worthy and without having the merit. It is just that, as Tufts University says, that diversity leads to excellence. Diversity leads to a deeper understanding of our history and of our culture. With respect to what should students do right now, I would encourage students to lean into their culture, to lean into their heritage. And in that way, they can very easily identify parts of their lived experience, which may be because they are Black, what makes them who they are. I think that's important for us not to run away from being Black, but rather to more deeply learn our history, to more deeply participate in organizations like Black student unions. Again, all of those are worthy of consideration, and I think this decision gives us an opportunity to dig deeper into who we are as a community.
Thank you for that. Jill, another question that I have is, how does one benefit from affirmative action as it was before yesterday?
Sure. So first, I will say what some previous justices in support of affirmative action have said. Affirmative action, number one, benefits everyone. It benefits the white students in the classroom. Great. It benefits the institution, and it benefits the individual. So if you're asking specifically, kind of what was the leg up specifically, that's what you're asking. So it varies school by school. So For example, you might have an institution, maybe at the one I am right now, that will say, you know, we get so many applicants that when we are taking a first cut, we will take a look at the law school admissions test. And if you are below X number, if you're white, we can't even take a look at you. Okay. That number might be set slightly lower for Black candidates, right? So that exclusionary number would be different. And then they then start their assessment, right? That is typically a way that affirmative action can play out. What schools also know is that, number one, when we get to discussions about merit and basing merit on SAT scores or LSAT scores, we know for a fact that that's simply not the case, right? And there have been studies that show that a white student with a particular SAT score is the equivalent of a Black student with a lower SAT score. They perform the exact same in the classroom. Their life trajectories are very similar because we know that these tests also have bias built into them. So I think that essentially what you can say is that what affirmative action did was try to level the playing field, number one, for the bias tests, and number two, somewhat as, well, don't know if we will ever have reparations in this country, but to try to serve as some sort of equalizer to disadvantages that come from segregated schools. Our schools right now are more segregated than they were at the time of Brown v. Board of Education. And our school financing system specifically sets up Black students to be in schools that are underfinanced, underserved, and that as a result, you're not going to have things like AP tests, right? So that is one of those criteria that college admissions can look at. They can say, how many AP tests did you take? Well, I could be a very bright student, and if I don't go to a school with AP tests, I'm taking 0. Right? Likewise, one of the criteria that they specifically described it was described in Harvard in the Harvard admissions process as what they call the lob, like when they do their final cut about who's actually going to get an offer. The final criteria that they consider in that list are legacy status, whether or not mom or dad went to Harvard, recruited athlete status, and we have to look at what some of these sports are that Harvard advances in, things like lacrosse and crew, financial aid eligibility, and then finally race, right? These were the 4 things considered. So when you look at the number of white students that are coming in, I think I heard a statistic, 46% of all admitted Harvard students had a parent that went to Harvard, right? That's phenomenal, right? And that is the direct legacy of our exclusion of my parents who could not compete to go to Harvard, right? So to put a thumb on the scale for me, or for even the next generation, right, that is what affirmative action essentially did.
Well, I think you bring up some excellent points, and I didn't notice that legacy was not touched in the ruling. And another thing about lacrosse and crew, the idea that how much money it costs to take these certain sports, and how much money it costs to I just have children, with the SAT, and I paid money to have them, go through all of this SAT prep, and that type of thing. So I think it does not just deal with race, but it deals with the social economics of a particular race that has always been fighting to kind of catch up with the wealth gap. And now I think this seems to further just tip the scale in favor of those who are grandparents, grandchildren, and children of people who already have wealth and economic status. So is there anything, Nicole, that you would like to add to that?
Well, absolutely. I think it has been, no, I think it has been well established about the relationship between standardized testing and income. And when we look at different systems like the University of California system, where they have now utilized a test-free admission policy as a way to level the playing field for not just Black students, but students who also happen to not be able to afford multiple rounds of tutoring, multiple rounds of sending test scores. It begins to become an economic hardship. But what I would like to say is, for students and for parents, I think we really want to focus on identifying colleges, universities, institutions, and communities that affirm our existence. Because even without this decision, there are places that don't want us, right? So this gives us an opportunity to really focus on where do we belong, and where will we be tolerated, and where will we be affirmed. And so how do we make that decision, particularly if you're a high school student, or maybe you're not a college counselor or a lawyer or a policy expert? I think we go and we look at the essays. What is a college asking for in their essays? That gives them, that gives you some insight into what matters to them. And so, for example, I was looking at Tufts University, and two of the three options for prospective applicants address the issue of identity and inclusion. For example, the second one says, how have the environments and experiences of your upbringing, your family, your home, neighborhood, or community shaped the person you are? That is clearly a question that gives you an opportunity to talk about how your race, your community has influenced you. And the Supreme Court decision is very clear that how your community, your culture, your heritage had an impact, positive or negative. The second question that Tufts asks is, please use a specific example about how you have contributed to an inclusive community. So that already tells us a little bit about what that university values. And so I would encourage students, when they're exploring colleges, is this a place that I want to be? And a college that does not explicitly ask those kinds of questions about identity and tell you up front that they value inclusion, that they value understanding who you are as an individual, are probably not the right place for you before or now after the Supreme Court decision.
Very good. Thank you for that. Another thing that is evident and is researched is that the school that you go to has a direct impact on the amount of money that you make in a job. So when we're talking about going to Yale, going to Harvard, going to UNC, there's a direct correlation to you end up in the top firms, you end up in the top jobs per se. And so economically, again, how do we not double hurt a community that's already economically behind in a wealth gap, and then deny access to such schools that would give them upward mobility?
Yeah, I'll just take this. There are rankings, and there's been data and an analysis of, not just the elite institutions. If you're already starting at a 9.5, and to move you from 9.5 to a 10 or a 95 to 100, not really that hard to do. But what are some of the universities that have been engines of social mobility? And so we look to those, and again, some of this is not dependent on the ruling that came out yesterday. I mean, there were already institutions that were engines of social inequality. right? Even before that. So this decision really doesn't change anything for many of these institutions. But what can we do right now as parents, as community members? You know, go to where we are going to be rewarded. And so there are rankings that look at colleges that have been traditionally, not only valuable for students who are already on third base, but where they have, opportunities to increase networking, where the career services program are strong. Maybe they admit a high number of students who are Pell Grant recipients and the like. The data is already there. I think the decision just forces us to address the reality.
Jill, were you going to add to that?
Yes, what I would love to see is decision makers actually motivate decision makers to understand.
We're having a hard time hearing you.
Sure. I would love for decision makers to understand that talent can be found everywhere, and not to punish Harvard, right? Because Harvard got sued. Harvard was trying to do the right thing and got sued, right? But to understand that that talented individual that isn't going to Harvard and now might be going to the state school, that you as a recruiter need to follow that student to the state school, right? Do not presume that these are the only institutions that are producing people that can do fantastic things with their careers and with their lives. That the elitism, right? We cannot, perpetuating the elitism isn't the answer. I do want to see Black students at the most elite institutions, but we cannot presume that that's the only place that you can find talent.
I love that. I absolutely love that. So as we discuss this further, there is it's kind of a myth, I think, that's kind of hanging in the air, that we're talking about a lot of African American schools, a lot of African Americans going to these elite top schools. And the percentages don't really bear that out. And so I had a question about part of the study that I looked at when it talked about African American schools, African Americans at Harvard, between the years that the Supreme Justices looked at, which was 2009 to I think 2018. In those numbers, Asian Americans were almost twice as likely to be accepted into Harvard during that time period. So can you kind of take us back to how it is that they were able to prove that there was some type of nefariousness in getting more Black students into these elite schools? I don't really understand how that equals what we got. Does that make sense?
Nicole, your admissions. You want to take this one?
Well, I mean, I think what happens, and even earlier today, I think all of us have shifted focus from whatever we were doing at work to find out what is really happening. And I was looking at some data at Berkeley, and I was really quite appalled when I discovered that roughly 2.8% of the University of California, Berkeley, are African Americans. Now we can add in other Black people if we're talking about Blacks from the Caribbean, if we're talking about Black people from the continent of Africa. The number goes up to I think maybe 3.6, right? So we're still talking about a very small number of Black people that are being impacted. To your point of what is happening at Harvard over those years, and Asian Americans being admitted, I think oftentimes what happens, whether we're looking at a SAT score, if we're looking at some of these outside measures, I mean, it is my opinion that universities have decided what is an acceptable number What is the number of students that they're going to admit based on different demographics? Let's say somebody who plays the cello, for example. Do they need 5 students who play the cello, or do they need 1 student who plays the cello? So I think that there are some, as we talk about in admission, some holistic admission factors that leave some room for opportunities for colleges to pull in who they want, whatever their institutional values are. I do think it is really quite important for us, though, to continue to know that there are places for us. I think it's important for us to be the very best self that we can be and not be dissuaded, maybe motivated, maybe inspired, but not disheartened. There is work to do, and I think we're here to do it.
Okay, so what I think I hear you saying is to go ahead and apply to those schools, even if you are African American, apply to these schools. We already had not enough African Americans applying to the schools because they felt like they weren't worthy of these schools. So how can we get them to, even despite this, to go ahead and say, I'm going to shoot for these elite schools if they so choose?
I mean, I think we have an obligation as community members, not just to pull them into Harvard or UNC or a Berkeley, but every student needs to have a rigorous high school education. Right. There are programs, the Algebra Project, for example, to ensure that students have a strong math foundation. There are numerous summer programs. Many of them are free, run by colleges and universities. And so I think that's one of the things that we can do. Having a stronger academic foundation supports you no matter where you decide to go. I think it's important as community members, sort of this each one teach one. So whether it's our neighbor or some other student that we happen to run across, take a look at their resume. Like, you know what? Like, this is really good. You've done all of the work that you need to do, but the formatting is going to turn off somebody because there's a couple of typos that you missed. So I think we have that sort of obligation. I think we have an obligation to, as adults, to make noise in the spaces that we're in. I am in an industry where oftentimes there's a greater percentage of non-Blacks than Blacks who are hiring me. In fact, I've done some diversity outreach with national organizations of college counselors. Take the burden off of these students. Take the burden. Don't adultify our kids, especially our high achieving ones, because oftentimes those are the ones who most need the support because they've always done the work themselves. So that would be my takeaway. As a community, continue to support and perhaps enhance the support that we're providing to students and make noise in the rooms that we're in.
Excellent. Jill, is there anything you would add to that?
I would. I think so much attention has been paid to Clarence Thomas's kind of remarks about how the stain of affirmative action kind of colored how he felt about being at elite institutions and all of that. I think we need to talk to students about what the experience is going to be. That it can in fact be isolating, but it doesn't mean that that needs to come with some sense of imposter syndrome. It's how to navigate these institutions once you get in that matters the most. And I would have much rather see Clarence Thomas work that out with a therapist than work it out in a Supreme Court opinion.
Amen. Amen. So if we could give our audience, first of all, I thank you for this rich conversation. And if there is anything you would like to give to our audience on a takeaway or something that they can do as a result of this ruling, what would it be?
Well, this may be my nail and hammer analogy, but we got to vote. None of this changes without having political power. So that would be the first thing. Do not dismiss the power of your individual vote. So that's the sort of the bare minimum to go ahead and to do that. Again, beyond that, befriend a student, a school, and ask how you can help.
Very good.
And all elections matter, right? They vote, and we think the big one that put, that turned our Supreme Court into this. But the small ones, it's the ones that are going on at your school board. Those are the people who are making decisions about curriculum, about access, and the things that really shape your child's education that make them a competitive candidate for all schools. So all the elections matter.
Yes, and I thank you so much for saying that, because our hope is that we would get African Americans to be more engaged, even beyond, first of all, getting them out to vote, because we vote at such low percentages, but then to see themselves as being able to, for us to come together and to make differences in what happens within our own communities. A lot of times I think we talk about the things that are going wrong, but we don't have an outlet in order to come together and to strategize. I think, Jill, it was you who said that this is a part of a 50-year strategy that just came to fruition yesterday. And so I would love for people to contact us and let's strategize and let's hold our elected officials accountable, and let's look and see what we would like the next 50 years to look like, because those that hate Blackness, they already have a strategy going. And so those of us who love Black bodies and Black people, we need to come together as well, and to see the vision. In order to have justice, you need to be able to see a just world and then work in that world to make it more just. So I would like to thank you both so much for this rich conversation, and just for allowing us to have a conversation about this important issue. And you've both given me hope as we've gone through this, that we just have to keep on keeping on. And so I'd like to know, are there any questions from our guest? Let's see, any questions before we go?
Well, I just want to thank you for creating this opportunity for us to reach out to the community, and and we are here as community resources. If anyone needs any help, whether it's with preparing a strategic application, needing guidance and how to be both successful in high school, as well as navigating that transition from high school to undergrad to professional school. I have a dear friend who often talks about support that is available, institutional support for first generation students, but we've also found that, especially within the Black community, it's not just first gen students who need support. It's the second gen and the third gen students who need support. So I would just encourage anyone who is listening to use the resources that are available. Some of these institutions that have been impacted, well, all of the institutions have been impacted, will ultimately be impacted, but some of what we consider the more highly selective institutions have ample resources that are oftentimes underutilized. You know, you had the merit, you had the grit, you had the expertise, the excellence to get into some of these schools. But the next step is we want you to graduate. The next step is we want you to use the networking opportunity so that you can use that ladder to pull up the next generation.
Thank you. Okay, and Jill, I just want to thank you so much for your expertise and just for your willingness to help us grapple with some of these issues.
Oh, you're very welcome.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you all for joining in, and I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy Juneteenth, I mean the 4th of July, all over again, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.